Please join us in the forum for the next panel, Incorporating History, Past, Present, Future.
Hi, welcome. My name is Galia Gichon. I am the author of The Accidental Suffragist, and I am moderating this panel. And this is an esteemed panel, so I'm really, really excited to be here from all four of you. I'm gonna get right into it. So if you could just quickly say your name and hold up your book so everybody knows who everybody is.
Hi, I'm Elise Hart Kipness, and I don't have my book with me, but it's in the bookstore. I just didn't bring it up on stage, and it's called Dangerous Play.
Hi, I'm Anna Noyes. My book is a novel called The Blue Maiden. Came out in May of this year.
Hi, I'm Chris Knapp. My book is States of Emergency, and it came out on Tuesday.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's exciting. I'm Claire Messud, and my book is This Strange Eventful History, and it also came out in May.
Same day.
I've either finished or read sections of all of them, and I recommend them all. Okay, I'm just gonna get right into it. As someone who's written historical fiction, a question that I got asked a lot and an issue that I grappled with is research versus writing. How do you balance it? How do you make these books not too sounding like a history book or a manual? And how do you take your creativity and employ that in? So we'll start here.
So I think my situation is a little bit different. I'm a former TV sports reporter, and I write about a TV sports reporter, and she's way cooler than me. She's also a soccer Olympic gold medalist, and I'm a soccer mom, so there's a way cooler aspect to her. But as a soccer mom, I really did live those elements of her stuff. But for me, most of my book, the research was during my other job, and I take a lot of what I did going into the tunnels of Madison Square Garden and Yankee Stadium and the behind the scenes and going into the locker rooms, and it's something I lived. So I really tried to bring that to the pages.
For me, for my book, there's a foundational event that's a witch trial that opens the book about 200 years prior to the main body of the work, taking place in the late 1600s. And so for that, I did a lot of research on there's a trial specifically I based it on. So there was a lot of reading of firsthand accounts, just trying to sort of tap into the mood and get the detail world pretty closely adhered to the actual events. But then beyond that, I think I really wanted to just focus more on the characters and the fictional plot and the mood. And so a lot of it was I really live in the detail world of my work, and I have a lot of natural world in this, and botany, and just the natural world and the plant life. And so I read Carl Linnaeus did a journey of these certain islands in Sweden, and my book is based on a Swedish island. So I would read these kinds of textural records, and just little small details would leap out at me. The kinds of details that leap out at you just from the world around you, being observational of your own texture of your life. And so I would often just note lists of that, and then try to organically incorporate it into creating an atmosphere, creating place, so that it felt interwoven in a way that was more smooth and not these details are so cool that they shine and you can tell that the research has really been cut into the text, if that makes sense.
And then Chris, I'm just gonna interject for a second because your book doesn't read like a historical fiction novel necessarily. I mean, yours is not historical, but so I'm just curious, research writing, and then if you can add a little bit about where's the historical part.
Yeah, You know, it's funny, I have heard people describe it as historical fiction. It takes place in 2015, 2016, and history seems to be accelerating so quickly that it feels historical to some. But when I started writing it, it was during that time, so a lot of the research was just kind of being alive and waiting to see what would happen next. But then another huge part of it was kind of finding these historical resonances with the present. And so, yeah, I spent a lot of time kind of looking at archives and trying to see how some of the mechanics of history were playing out in real time as history was happening all around us.
My novel starts in 1940 and ends in 2010, and there are sort of 7 sections, one each decade. So it gets less historical as it goes along, and you know, so I was still having to do some research even about times that eras that I remember, so because you're just not really sure. But for the more I did a fair amount of research for the more historical stuff, not least because it's inspired by the trajectory of my father's family, and they were French colonials in Algeria who were then, after Algerian independence, which happened in 1962, but my family even before, were in diaspora sort of around the world. So so it was also learning about places as well as historical times. But I had some I read, published books and looked at archives, and there's amazing stuff on YouTube. Who knew there would be like a video of a guy, a newsreel video of a guy driving a truck through the Sahara in the early 50s to an oil well? Like, who knew? But it's amazing. But also my grandfather had handwritten a memoir for my sister and me of his life and my grandmother's life when first they were married, 1928 to 46. So that's not much of the time covered in the novel, but it gave me a real sense of the lives that they lived and the places that they were in. And then I also have, because clearly everybody in my family is hoarders, we are all hoarders. So I have all sorts of letters, and I have letters that my father came to study in the States from Algeria. That's where they then lived in 1952-3, and I have all not his letters, but all the letters they sent to him. So stuff like that really gives you, and that letters are sort of amazing. I mean, there are certain types of archives that are really interesting because they're not the public history. They're not what's in the history books. It's the sort of little stuff of like, you can't get any rice these days, or whatever it is,
All right, 2 questions. So for the 3 of you, did you travel to do research? I mean, Chris, you do live in Paris, so clearly the travel was more to the US, but how did travel for Anna and Claire? Did you travel for research for this book? And I know for me, just really quickly, I was too hesitant. I didn't even go to the Tenement Museum. I didn't go because I didn't want it to color my writing. So I'm curious how travel played into that. Because those are fun places to go to.
I know, I would love to have traveled, and I want to still, and I didn't. My book being set in Sweden, my publisher would have to pay me more to go. It was written mostly during the pandemic as well, so, but thankfully, it's set on a small isolated island. I live on a tiny isolated island, so there was a lot of firsthand kind of imbued in just my experience here that translated thankfully over. I also grew up in Down East Maine, which is a very rugged, kind of barren coastal environment, and a Swedish woman was just telling me it looks exactly like the area of Sweden that my fictional island is set in. So that was really helpful, and I based a lot of it on me growing up in by the ocean and on the beach, and that kind of menace that is inherent in Maine that also sort of seeped into my book in Sweden. So it was
It reminded me a little bit of books that I've read that are set in the barren area.
There's an amalgam, I think, of Maine and Fisher's Island, and it was also set. Islands are unique microclimates, and there was thankfully a great crossover between Fishers and these. I based it off of a couple of islands in Sweden, Åland and Gotland Island primarily. So that was really helpful because I worked at the museum in my island, and they talked a lot about the unique biodiversity, and I was like taking notes on all these special flowers and plants. And
Great.
So a lot of that didn't really necessitate travel, but I really want to go. There's a national park that's in my book called Blåkulla that is like an uninhabited, it's actually called the Blue Maiden, not Blåkulla. That's the spirit realm that's said to take place on the island, but it has a labyrinth on it, and it's got a lot of pagan.
That's great. How about you, Claire? Did you get to travel?
I did do a little. I just want to interject, though, if you didn't know, Anna, I believe that Ingmar Bergman's family runs an artist's retreat on the island that was his
Island.
Was his island. So
I gotta go.
You gotta
That's
go.
my in.
You gotta go. And then I think also, I don't know if you can go visit it, but it's not Sweden, but Finland. The writer Tove Jansson. Mm-hmm. I think she had an island where she was literally like the only person on the island, and I met somebody Finnish who wrote a novel about her, and part of it was going to live alone on that island for a while, but maybe you can get in there too. I feel like get some.
I think this is an idea for retreats. Anybody?
Yeah, right.
I know. I'm like loath to leave my deserted island for another, but I should.
Just for a couple weeks. I don't know. So I did over time a certain amount of travel, and some of it made it into the book, and some of it didn't. There are a lot of different places that show up in the novel, and the sort of the most direct trip that I took was there's an opening section in what is now Thessaloniki in Greece, where my grandfather was the naval attaché, French naval attaché from in 3940, and it's a completely different city now, but I did manage to go and visit there, and it was completely fascinating. I also went to Beirut, but I would have loved to go to Algeria, and that's not really so easy to do. And then at one point I wanted to go to Argentina because there's an Argentina part of the book, but it was the pandemic, so I didn't make it. So, thank goodness for, the internet with all those amazing resources.
True. Yeah. And Chris, how about you? So you are an American who lives in Paris. So talk to us a little bit about.
The nice thing about living in Paris and setting a book there is I didn't really have to travel, except I would just sort of wander out my door and just sort of drift around and think my little thoughts, and then go home and try to write them down. Only part of the book is set in Paris, and for the other parts, it was trips to. I went for there's a section that deals with the New York water system, so went for a hike with my dad, who's here somewhere. And, just sort of walked around and got some of the, just picked up some of the details of the landscape and the feel of the place. And, I think just anytime you can go and just sort of wander around somewhere and sort of soak it up, like that, all of that kind of enriches the feel of the place on the page.
And then Elise, yours, and it's funny, in your book I remember the tunnels of Madison Square Garden. I thought, that's it's like seeing behind Disney World, right? Behind the facade. So obviously you did it when you were working there, but did you go back at all and visit any of these places?
Not a lot. I would go into bed, and I like to write from bed with my little lap desk and kind of close my eyes and return in that way. It was still pretty fresh in my mind. I mean, I did write about Madison Square Garden before they did the renovation, because that's what was so memorable to me, and the rusty elevators behind the scenes and the smells and all of that. I did go back to Yankee Stadium because my second book is about soccer, but being played at the Olympics at Yankee Stadium. And I did go on one of those tours, you know, and everyone's like looking at the statues, and I'm like, can we go down that hall? And they're like, no. And I'm like, come on, just for a minute. I need to go see the media library, the media cafeteria, because they would feed us like before games and everything. But a lot of it was just kind of still in my brain, yeah.
It was fun to read. Now, will you keep, for all four of you, will you keep writing in this genre? Because, and Claire, I'll start with you. So I've read your previous books, and I think I fangirled you before, saying that they left a huge impact on me. They're beautifully written, and so those books are not necessarily historical fiction, and I would say they're, from my very amateur standpoint, much more character-driven, and just, I mean, you really got to know those characters, and you didn't always love them, but that's okay. That meant that we had strong emotions. So reading this book, while it was character-driven also, but obviously I think the setting was a character. So will you continue? And for all, that's a question for all of you. You specifically, because your previous books were different.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't really think of it as the project as historical fiction in a way. It was for me about character, but there's a lot of history in the book. So I've always been a little afraid of historical fiction. I remember Peter Carey, the writer, saying that it's like a science fiction of the past, right? You can't think of it as a literal thing that you're trying to recreate the world exactly as it was. It has to be an imagined thing. And so I guess that in some way we're all creating some, as it were, science fiction of the present too when we write contemporary. So that's not an answer to your question, except to say, I don't think I'll on purpose write something historical, although one might have to have historical bits in it. But I have some friends who are really wonderful historical novelists, and that thing of going to inhabit far away, like really inhabit the minds of far away history. Like Geraldine Brooks is somebody who has written a lot of really wonderful books.
Great.
And she and she's somebody who really, like, it's a passion not just to know the stuff, but to inhabit what it was like.
It takes a talent, I think, to write history or historical without it sounding like, again, like a history novel or a history book or And Chris, your book obviously is a little more present. What I thought was fascinating was the American in Paris. And yet you sounded like such a French person at times. So, but talk to us about what's next. Are they all going to be, and I know you were, the setting is in different places too, but to me, Paris seemed the...
Yeah, I think it'll be, I plan to stay in Paris, and I think it'll be hard to stay there without wanting to write more about it. There's just, it's such a, there's so much history there, obviously, and it's all kind of hard to ignore because they have little plaques everywhere telling you what happened in this place at this time. And yeah, so I do hope to continue writing about the Paris of the present, but also, how all of these bits of history kind of inform the present and can be felt in the present.
There's some great Parisian novels. I just read the Paris novel by Ruth Rachel, and then I think it was The Nanny by Leilani, which, so, seeing as people who love Paris.
Dark one.
I'm sorry?
That's a dark one.
Oh, yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yes, no. Don't read it if you have small children. But seeing Paris from a different perspective, I thought was really great for me, because you're like, oh, people go through fertility in Paris, even though of course they do, but just it was a human element.
Yeah, so I generally, I wrote a short story collection called Goodnight, Beautiful Women before this book, and most of the stories, all the stories revolved around women who were kind of societal outsiders and what happens when you deviate from the norms or expectations of womanhood or girlhood, and will you still be loved and embraced by your family or your community or yourself, or will you be exiled? So within those themes, I think witches and thinking of witch trials and that kind of legacy always felt like potent material that was in the same vein, even though those stories are mostly take place in contemporary settings. Some of them are historical too, but I think I'm more interested in exploring that terrain than when or where or what brings it about. But I did, like Claire, I kind of struggled entering into the label of historical fiction, and for a while I didn't even want to date it or even place it, which my editors were like, no, thank you.
That's an interesting theme, though, that,
yeah.
you know, writing about women, that can be such a very broad, in a good way, who don't fit into the norm of society. That can just even be like the suburban mom who, you know, doesn't want to be a suburban mom.
And there's something very out of time for me about it and kind of like applicable today. So I didn't want it to seem too much like this is the atrocity that happened then, as it still feels like it's the sort of ripple effect of that and the pressures of that are ongoing. But I started out with this book as a 600-page epic that involved a lot of family history and ended up culling it to a very tiny portion. So I think there might be some sort of a trilogy in there that will force me to get back to historical writing after a big breather. Yeah.
And then Elise, you've written 2 books.
Yes, so
And they're obviously central character, theme. Is this your genre? Is this your theme? Or are you just going to keep going? They're great. They're really they're wonderful reads. I've read one. I've got the other in my bag. So.
thank you. So there will be a third Kate Green book that will take place at the US Open tennis. And then I think I'm going to do something a little different, but still staying in the thriller suspense and with a reporter, whether it'll be sports or a news reporter. I was both. I was a news reporter at WNBC before I went to be a sports reporter. And I have a lot of opinions on news, especially news now and media. And I try to weave that into the story, not like in a hit you over the head with it view, but in there, and I still feel like I have a lot more to say about it. So,
I thought the book that I read, which was not the one that's in there, I read your previous one, but there was a theme of just women in the corporate world.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, she was really just constantly going up against not getting promotions and not getting the top stories, and the man did, and she did something that a man would have gotten away with, but she was chided and put on suspension, so I thought that was an interesting angle.
thank you. I was a reporter in the time where, and it may still be the case, but especially in sports, there weren't a lot of women. And while you saw women like on each of the sports stations, behind the scenes, you didn't see that. It was like 40 men and 4 women who were covering the sports because each station had their female there. And I really felt at the time that I was lucky to be in the game, you know, no pun intended, like just, you know, thankful and lucky me, I get to be there. And I ignored a lot of aggression and sexism and like so many things. And I think that it was very cathartic for me to write these books because my main character, Kate, stands up for herself in a way I never did. And it's so great to like sit down and write that. And I think it's helping me process a lot of those
Kind of
times.
like when someone says something to you and then 10 minutes later you're like, God, why didn't I say that? Or an hour
Right,
later.
exactly. I'm like constantly chewing that out now.
So this is just throwing this question out there, and I didn't find it with all your books, but sometimes with historical fiction, and I know it was with mine, there's a little bit of a statement or a mission or, you know, so yours is women standing up for themselves in corporate world and I'm just curious if anybody else had that or wanted to get that message across. It may not because not all historical fiction, but I felt like there was a little bit of a theme in all the books here, just about, is there a message that you can get across in a, Claire, if you want to start.
I might just say I was trying, I think there were 2 there was not a message per se, but I realized this memoir that my grandfather wrote, he called it Everything That We Believed In. And you know, at one point in the memoir, he's included a letter that he wrote for his children at the time in the war, in case that he and my grandmother didn't survive the war, and it was to be, you know, one of those letters like in a novel to be opened in the event of our deaths. And he said, in the letter, he said, "This is what you need to know: we're Mediterranean, we're Catholic, we're Mediterranean, we're Latin, we're Catholic, we're French. Those are the things that we are." And when I read this, like a lapsed Protestant North American person, I was like, wow, that. I see why he wrote this, because he wanted me to understand and then I realized, because I'd been researching stuff, but I started writing 2017, and I looked around at the world that my kids were coming of age in, and I thought, all the things that I took for granted, the world that my parents raised me to believe in and to expect would surround us, which is a world of hybridity and cosmopolitanism and borders coming down and cooperation between cultures. You know, 2017 was just not looking, that was not looking so much the picture. And so that was part of what I, just to try to describe that post-war, there were a lot of mistakes in the second half of the 20th century, but there was a lot of optimism too after the horrors of World War II. There was a lot of joy. So I wanted to try to capture a little of that.
I think what I was trying to capture, maybe not so much a message, but you know, it's just this moment in time where it really felt like the world that we thought we knew was kind of coming apart at the seams. And so I think with all of the stuff that's looking backwards and into history, like I really wanted to look at like, where are the places that we could have seen this coming? And so I think that was sort of what I was going for with the more historical bits of the book.
So are we better for it on the other side? Are we better for it? Are we in a better place on the other side? I mean, that's a very big picture and personal question. But, you know, when you say coming apart at the seams, you're like, well, hopefully have we learned anything? Or,
yeah, but time will tell.
Yeah, I was really interested in, you know, I am drawn to witches and the idea of witchcraft in a kind of a, almost like a cozy kind of, you know, practical magic, Halloween time. I feel, and I like that, like it's very juicy to me. But I also was just thinking, you know, this is a history, this is a lived reality that people went through, and the way that we deal with it culturally, I think, speaks to how we devalue women's trauma and experiences and trivialize them. And I'm part of that as well, but I think, you know, in the European witch trials specifically, like hundreds of thousands of women were executed. And I didn't know about this, but in researching my Swedish ancestry, you know, the region that I base the opening event in my book on, 1/5 of the women in the region died overnight and were executed by their husbands and their sons and their fathers and their priests.
it's a powerful first scene.
And so, yeah, thinking about,
first
you know,
scene was really powerful.
yeah, and I think there's a way in which we can hear the words witchcraft and think something sort of salacious or it's sensationalized. And I think actually that happened to women, and that's who witches are. And so really like wanting literature to reflect the lived reality and explore what's that like when 1/5 of your women are gone? How do you recover from that as an isolated small community, as any community, you know? And also along those lines, just thinking of, you know, the trauma and the violence that our spaces are built on, and, you know, 200 years passing, because my book opens in the 1600s and it goes to the 1800s, but you know, we sort of think of history sometimes as something removed from our present day, when in fact, like, I think if you're sensitive to those things, if you're repressed by those lineages, like, that hauntedness surrounds you. And it's like the past is very permeable with the present. So I think that was important to me too, to just say, you know, look, we're feeling these echoes all the time, you know.
No, those are great points. I've got so many questions. I'm like, I don't want to run out of time. I shouldn't make assumptions, but I think, and maybe this is, if that's not the case, pass, but I feel like there was something personal of each of you in your stories. How did it feel to share that? Because that's a real vulnerable part as a writer, and I know it's something I struggle with, like how much should I share? Is my mom gonna read this? So if you were sharing things, or if you put anything in there, you know, and Chris, I'll say, you know, you're writing about fertility. Maybe that has nothing to do with you. I shouldn't make assumptions, but how did it feel as a writer if you did put in something that was really vulnerable and intimate, knowing that either close friends or family were gonna read it, or just more that you're sharing into the world?
It's interesting, and I don't know if all of you have felt this too, but so much of what I put into it, I didn't realize until later. For example, I got the question a bunch of times, why did you write crime fiction? You know, it made sense that I wrote about a sports reporter. And I mean, I was a news reporter, but I was thinking about it, and I had heard Lisa Unger speak about this, and I'm gonna mash exactly what she said, but the essence was that she writes to kind of get the darkness out or purge that kind of thing. And that really struck me because I covered so much tragedy. I covered the Flight 800 crash and Long Island Railroad massacre. And you're a reporter, so you're not, you're keeping your distance from it. And it's not your tragedy. Like, these people are living something awful. But I would come home every night after Flight 800 and, covering it, because I covered it for a month, and cry. Like, my mom's like, you're always depressed. And, you know, she goes, but it makes sense, like, you're seeing death every day. And I think that the reason I wrote all of that was just to try to get it out of me. And it was very heavy, but I didn't realize I was doing that at the time.
Yeah, I love your answer too. I think my books are quite dark, and people will often be like, well, you don't seem dark as a person, or like, where does this come from? A lot of the darkest, most like troubling scenes in the book are based on a real event, you know? So I think sometimes I feel like, well, we're surrounded by darkness, and maybe like the most sensitive or, you know, if you're a sensitive and attuned or even like joyful or hopeful person, you're like even more deeply impacted by those dark events, and they really like preoccupy, trouble, and perplex and need to be processed by those among us like that, with those temperaments. But yeah, I mean, this book, my first book was like much more directly autobiographical in the way, you know, what appeared. I mean, it was a young woman set and growing up in Maine, and you know, this I felt like, oh, thank goodness I'm getting away from these, like, my mom can't read it and go like, I know it's me, and I'm deeply wounded. So that was kind of like a weight lifted. But I realized like it's really not escapable, because I felt some real safety in choosing something that was much more like overtly fictionalized, but then like I really had to tap into my own sense of like fear growing up as a girl, you know, all of the sort of emotional backing is deeply personal and interior, regardless of where it's set or who the characters are or where they are. And so I think that's a good thing.
It definitely brings up a lot when you're writing.
It's infused with me.
Not to put you on the spot, Chris, obviously when I was reading about the fertility, it was very moving.
Yeah, you know, writing from personal experience is pretty terrifying. It also has that element of catharsis. I think that's a really important part of it. But another part of it is that if you're writing about your own personal experiences, you're also writing about other people's personal experiences, people who
Right. You can't just
write
so about yours.
You know,
You're not a solo person in this journey.
Yeah, so you have to, you know, spend a lot of time thinking about the ethics around that. How, you know, how much, and you know, also you can just ask them. But so that's something, you know, like there are characters in the book who are based on friends, and I have to tell them, you know, so there's this character based on you, doesn't come off that well in the book, but that's not you. That's not
Right, no.
That character has a mustache, and you don't have a mustache.
Right.
Obviously not you.
All right,
Yeah,
we've got like, I just got that warning signal that we're almost done. So Claire, if you want to quickly add, and then I have one last question to wrap it up. So, because you obviously shared a lot too in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that to Chris's point, that if it doesn't feel urgent to the writer, it's probably not going to feel urgent to the reader.
Great tip.
And there are lots of different ways of things being personal, and they can be, ideas personal or personal experience personal. There is that family problem. I teach creative writing, and students are always saying, like, how can I write this story about my mom and have her read it and it all be okay? And I'm like, I don't know. So that's a tough
We all have
one.
stories about our mothers, don't
Yeah,
we, right?
that's a tough one. I can't. But it is also where sometimes the most. And I think one of the things, you get older and you're like, well, I'll be dead soon, so. Like what am I waiting for now? So.
All right, my last question, and this is my dear friend Heather Frimmer, who's another author with me. She gave me this question, and it's actually my favorite question that I like to hear when I'm listening to a panel is, what is your writing process? I'm always fascinated. Do you write every day? Do you write at 5 in the morning? Do you catch it here and there? Do you have to leave your house? I write on Metro North really well, so I think it's something all aspiring writers can learn from.
My writing process for the first book and the second book are obviously very different because it took me a long time to get there for the first book and to get the agent and to get my publisher. And then once I did, and I didn't feel like I was a real author, I felt like I was a pretend author, so I didn't feel like I could say, this is my job and I'm working and no, I can't go pick your kids up and mine too, and like I couldn't set boundaries. And I really did have severe imposter syndrome. The second book was due a year later from the first book, and I have another deadline for June 4th, which, June 4th, it's not like June 5th, it's not June 3rd, it's June 4th, I have to get that done. So now I take myself more seriously in that I'm working from morning to night, and I do write in the mornings when I'm more like in that dream phase that everyone else talked about, and then I sort of do the admin stuff, which I actually like using that other part of my brain too.
Great.
Mine is really in flux. My short stories I would write often in one sitting overnight, like 12-hour stretches. I'm not in that place anymore physiologically. I have a 2-year-old daughter now, so my writing process is basically writing during naps. But I do think that it's created a lot of urgency and kind of compression, and I get right down to it. And one thing, this book, having written the stories in these brief little flashes, this one took me 8 years. And one of the things, when I finally found so much pleasure in the process, was finally being able to focus on the language level, because that's where I really find joy in it. So like iteratively going back and reading a paragraph over and over and just responding to it with my sort of internal barometer and tweaking obsessively brings me a lot of delight. And as George Saunders says, it's sort of like ritual self-expansion. The more that you respond and change and steer a text like word and even comma by comma towards something that resonates with you, it almost feels like spiritually satisfying. And so that I find a lot of pleasure.
How about you?
Yeah, right. I mean, one of the strange things that I've found really important for me is to have a chair that's not like too comfortable. And
So you learned something new, right?
if it's too comfortable in the chair, then I just kind of get complacent, and I don't know. So I wrote I would say like most of the book at the National Library in Paris, which has these chairs that are just like the perfect amount of comfortable. And it's also just this really wonderful setting because you go in, you're immersed, you're surrounded by students who are studying for their baccalaureate, and and just all these great books. But then you walk out and it's kind of like underground, and there's like this atrium. It doesn't look like the Paris of anyone's imagination. It feels more like a 90s version of like the spaceship in WALL-E. And so then you go up and there's this sort of observation deck, and it's just full of people from the neighborhood kind of conducting their lives in this public space. So it's just like a really satisfying way to spend your day.
I love it. So just because we are out of time, but so Claire, why don't you finish up and tell us especially you're a professor, you've written many novels, so I don't know if you're writing now on deadline, but is there a time of day or is there a place that really does work for you?
It's each time different. And I would just say the one thing that doesn't change is that I write by hand, and I have a particular type of notebook that I like to use and a particular type of pen, and then that, it's very portable.
Write by hand.
You can do that all sorts of places. So.
Yeah. So do you not want to jinx it, and do you keep writing the same notebook and the same pen just because you're like, okay, this is working? And
I feel like it's like Pavlov's dog,
Yeah.
I mean, just 2 seconds, I would say, like, it's a job that seems to have vanished from the world, but in my youth, I was a temp, and I can type wicked fast. And you type wicked fast, maybe sometimes faster than you think, and it's on a screen, it looks pretty good. You're like, hey, that's not bad, but actually it's terrible. So when you write by hand, you sort of stop and think. Right. And also, it's a very different, like, you can move stuff around on a computer, but you can't on a piece of paper so easily, so you're thinking about it before you put it down. So that works for me.
Well, thank you to our panel. I mean, I have about 5 more questions that I didn't get answered. We are all going to the room in the back for book signing, so please purchase all these books, and they will sign books for you. And join me in thanking our wonderful panel here.
And thank you, Galia.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You can get a chance to ask questions to everybody while they're signing your books.